I am Warren. I am 63 years old, and my only son thought he could build his empire by tearing me down. He cornered me at a family barbecue, jabbing his finger into my chest 13 separate times while calling me a parasite. He thought I was just a grieving, helpless old man standing in his backyard. What he did not know, and what his laughing wife filming the entire thing on her phone did not realize, was that I legally owned the very ground they were standing on. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply walked to my car and made a single phone call that erased their entire existence. Before I tell you exactly how I sold their house while they were still eating dessert, let me know what city you are listening from down in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that respect must be earned and abuse should always be met with absolute ruin. It was the 4th of July, and the suburban air was thick with the smell of expensive grilled meats and the sound of fireworks popping in the distance. I pulled my 10-year-old truck up to the curb of a sprawling 2-story modern colonial home. To the rest of our extended family, this house was a monument to my son Cameron and his massive success in the corporate world. The driveway was lined with imported luxury cars, and the manicured lawn stretched out like a green carpet toward a custom stone fire pit. Cameron and his wife Brittany played the role of the perfect wealthy hosts. Brittany was floating around the patio in a designer sundress, sipping a mimosa, while Cameron held court near the outdoor kitchen, a heavy crystal glass of single malt scotch resting in his hand. No one at that party knew the truth about the brick and mortar surrounding them. They did not know that 5 years ago, when Cameron's credit score was completely destroyed by his own reckless spending, I quietly purchased this property entirely in cash through a blind, limited liability company. I did it to protect him. I let him believe he was paying a standard mortgage to a faceless bank, when in reality those monthly payments were going directly into my holding account, which I then used to silently pay their property taxes and maintenance fees. I built a financial fortress around my son so he could sleep soundly at night. He rewarded my silent sacrifice with pure contempt. I walked into the backyard carrying a simple homemade potato salad. The moment I stepped onto the patio, the atmosphere shifted. My extended family, cousins, aunts, and nephews offered me polite, pitying smiles. Ever since my wife passed away 2 years ago, I had become the family ghost, a tragic figure they had to tolerate. Cameron barely looked at me. He snatched the bowl from my hands and handed it to a caterer, loudly joking that I should not have bothered bringing cheap food to a premium cookout. I swallowed the insult. I took a seat in a folding chair near the edge of the lawn, content to remain out of the way. But Cameron was not interested in peace. He was pacing. The scotch had fueled a dangerous kind of arrogance in him. Lately, he had been obsessing over a new business venture, a high-risk commercial investment that required a massive injection of liquid capital. He had burned through his own savings, and the banks would not lend to him. There was only one source of money left in his orbit: the life insurance payout from my late wife. It was a substantial sum meant to secure my retirement and pay for my medical care in my twilight years. I had already told him in private that the money was absolutely off-limits. I thought the matter was closed. I was wrong. Cameron clinked a silver spoon against his scotch glass, demanding the attention of the 30 people gathered on the patio. The music was turned down. The conversations stopped. Everyone turned to look at the golden boy. He started with a toast to family, but his eyes locked onto me, cold and predatory. He walked slowly across the stone pavers, standing directly over my folding chair. He announced to the entire crowd that true family supports one another. He told them about his brilliant new business plan, a plan that was guaranteed to make millions, a plan that was currently being blocked by one stubborn, selfish obstacle: me. He held his hand out palm up and publicly demanded that I transfer the life insurance funds to his corporate account by Monday morning. He framed it as an act of duty. He told our relatives that since I was old and living a useless, quiet life, sitting on that money was a betrayal to the family legacy. The silence in the backyard was absolute. I looked around at the faces of my siblings and my nieces. Not a single person spoke up to defend me. They just stared, waiting to see if the old man would fold under the pressure. I looked up at my son. I kept my voice incredibly soft, perfectly even. I told him no. I told him that his mother worked her entire life to build that safety net, and I would not let him gamble it away on a pipe dream. The word no snapped something inside him. His face flushed dark red. The polished corporate facade vanished, replaced by the spoiled, vicious child he had truly become. He threw his crystal glass onto the lawn. It did not shatter, but the scotch splashed across my shoes. He stepped straight into my personal space looming over me. He raised his right hand and pointed a stiff index finger directly at my heart. Then he struck me. He jabbed that finger hard into my chest bone. 1. He told me I was a pathetic old man. He jabbed me again. 2. He called me a freeloader. 3. He said I was a parasite draining the joy out of his life. 4. 5. 6. Each strike was harder than the last, driving the breath out of my lungs, pushing me back against the canvas of the chair. 7. 8. 9. He screamed that if I did not sign the transfer papers, he would legally declare me incompetent and throw me into the cheapest, most miserable state-run facility he could find. 10. 11. 12. He leaned in so close I could smell the alcohol and the bitter hatred on his breath. He delivered the final strike hard enough to leave a deep, dark bruise over my heart. 13. I did not retaliate. I did not raise my hands to block him. I simply sat there and absorbed the physical abuse, counting every single impact. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Brittany. She was not horrified. She was leaning against the outdoor kitchen counter, holding her smartphone up, recording the entire assault with a wide, mocking grin on her face. She was filming my humiliation for her own entertainment. I looked back at the crowd of relatives. My own brother looked down at his shoes. My cousins suddenly found their drinks fascinating. They were all complicit in their silence. They had chosen their side. In that exact second, the father who loved Cameron died. The man sitting in that chair was no longer a grieving widower or a supportive parent. I became a machine of pure consequence. I slowly stood up. The patio was so quiet, you could hear the wind rustling through the oak trees. I did not offer a profound speech. I did not threaten him back. I looked Cameron dead in the eyes, adjusted my jacket, and walked away. I walked past the imported cars, past the custom landscaping I had secretly paid for, and got into my truck. I turned the key in the ignition. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was time to show my son what a real financial empire looks like when it crashes down on your head. The drive away from the subdivision took exactly 22 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in absolute silence, watching the suburban landscape shift from the manicured lawns of my son's neighborhood to the older, more established streets where I lived. My chest still throbbed where Cameron had driven his finger into my ribs, but the physical pain was entirely secondary to the cold, terrifying clarity that had taken over my mind. For years, I had operated under the delusion that unconditional love meant unconditional forgiveness. I had excused his arrogance as ambition. I had overlooked his disrespect as stress from his corporate job. I had allowed him to treat me like a burden because I wanted to protect the fragile bond we had left after his mother died. That delusion perished on his patio. I parked my 10-year-old truck in the driveway of my modest brick home. The house was completely quiet. I walked straight past the living room and entered my home office, locking the solid wood door behind me. I went directly to the corner of the room and knelt in front of a heavy steel fireproof safe. I spun the dial, inputting the combination my late wife and I had chosen 3 decades ago. The heavy locking mechanism clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. I bypassed the envelopes containing our old tax returns and my retirement portfolio. I reached into the very back of the dark metal cavity and pulled out a thick manila folder labeled merely as property holdings. I laid the folder flat on my heavy oak desk and opened it under the bright glow of the desk lamp. Inside sat the original notarized deed to the luxury suburban home Cameron and Brittany currently occupied. The crisp legal document did not have Cameron's name on it. It did not have Brittany's name on it either. It was registered exclusively to a blind limited liability company, of which I was the sole managing director and 100% equity owner. 5 years ago, Cameron came to me in an absolute panic. He had attempted to purchase his first home to impress his new corporate colleagues, but his credit rating was completely destroyed. He had maxed out numerous credit cards, defaulted on auto loans, and carried massive amounts of undisclosed personal debt from his reckless bachelor years. No legitimate banking institution would give him a mortgage for a tool shed, let alone a premium colonial estate. He was facing massive public humiliation in front of his peers and his new fiancée. Instead of letting him face the consequences of his actions, I decided to catch him before he hit the ground. I used my own liquid capital to purchase the property entirely in cash. I then set up the corporate holding company and created a sophisticated lease agreement that Cameron firmly believed was a standard bank mortgage. For half a decade, my son had been writing a monthly check to a designated corporate account. He constantly bragged to his friends about his prime interest rate and his high-value real estate investment. He had no idea that his monthly payments were less than half of the actual market rate for that neighborhood. He did not know that the corporate account was controlled entirely by me. Every single month, I took his inadequate payments and quietly added my own money to cover the massive property taxes, the neighborhood association fees, and the premium structural insurance. I subsidized his wealthy lifestyle while he called me a parasite in front of our entire family. He believed he was a self-made man standing proudly on top of the world. He did not realize I owned the very mountain he was standing on. I ran my fingers over the raised golden seal of the deed. The time for silent subsidies was over. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a leather-bound address book. I flipped past the numbers of the family members who had watched me get assaulted. I turned to the business contacts section and found a specific number. It belonged to a man who operated a corporate liquidation firm. He specialized in aggressive acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and moving massive amounts of distressed capital in absolute secrecy. He catered to private equity investors who wanted to park their cash in American real estate without asking too many questions. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the number. The liquidator answered on the second ring. I did not exchange pleasantries or explain my personal situation. I told him I had a premium piece of suburban real estate that needed to be liquidated immediately. I gave him the exact address, the square footage, and the details of the recent kitchen renovations I had secretly paid for last year. I heard him typing on his keyboard, pulling up the property records and the aerial satellite views on his end. He noted the extremely high value of the neighborhood and asked what my timeline was. I told him I needed an all-cash offer and I needed the transaction finalized before the sun went down today. He paused. He warned me that an expedited weekend sale involving a blind company transfer would require a steep financial discount. He offered me a figure that was exactly 40% below the current market value. Most sellers would have hung up the phone in disgust. I accepted the offer without a single second of hesitation. The money did not matter to me anymore. I had enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. What mattered right now was the sheer speed of the execution. I gave the liquidator one non-negotiable condition for the sale. The new buyer had to take physical possession of the property within 48 hours. There would be no grace periods. There would be no extended move-out dates. The buyer would receive the deed free and clear, and in return, they would be responsible for immediately securing the premises with their own personnel. The liquidator agreed to the terms. He told me he had a cash-rich development firm looking for premium rental properties in that exact zip code. They had the funds ready to wire and their own private security contractors to handle immediate corporate evictions. He emailed the digital transfer contracts directly to my secure terminal. I sat at my computer and read through the legal jargon. Every clause was airtight. I was legally transferring the full ownership of the limited liability company and all its physical assets to the development firm. By signing this document, I was permanently vaporizing Cameron's entire domestic reality. I thought about the feeling of his finger jabbing violently into my chest. I thought about Brittany laughing as she recorded the abuse on her expensive phone. I typed my digital signature onto the bottom line and hit the submit button. The confirmation screen flashed, indicating the transmission was complete. I printed a hard copy of the transfer receipt and placed it inside the empty manila folder. The house was completely gone. The manicured lawn, the custom fire pit, the expensive kitchen where they hosted their lavish parties, none of it belonged to them anymore. They were currently sitting in the backyard of a house owned by a ruthless corporation that wanted them out by any means necessary. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was early evening. The barbecue would be winding down. Cameron would be pouring another glass of scotch, feeling like an absolute king who had just put his useless old father in his place. He had no idea the crown had already been stripped from his head. But the house was only the first domino to fall. The physical foundation was gone, but I needed to ensure the financial walls collapsed completely around him. I left the home office and walked toward my computer in the living room. It was time to sever the rest of his lifelines. The transfer receipt for the house sale was safely tucked away, but my work was far from over. Selling the property removed the roof over their heads, but I needed to ensure the ground beneath their feet crumbled just as thoroughly. I left my home office and walked into the living room where my personal laptop sat on the coffee table. The house was completely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I sat down on the sofa and opened the laptop. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the darkened room. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to my primary banking portal. I typed in my secure credentials and watched the screen load. A list of accounts appeared before me. For years, I had treated these accounts like a sacred duty. I had meticulously managed the balances, making sure there was always enough liquid cash to catch my son whenever he stumbled. Now I was looking at these numbers not as a safety net, but as a weapon. I navigated to the automated transfers section of my dashboard. A long list of recurring payments populated the screen. Each line item represented another invisible crutch I had placed under Cameron and Brittany to keep them standing tall in their affluent social circle. The first item on the list was a heavy monthly draft for a luxury imported sport utility vehicle. Brittany drove a brand new top-of-the-line model. She constantly bragged to her friends at the country club about how Cameron insisted she drive the safest, most expensive vehicle on the market. She loved the heated leather seats and the panoramic sunroof. She did not know that Cameron had been rejected by the dealership financing department due to his terrible credit history. I was the one who co-signed the lease and set up the automatic payments from my personal checking account to ensure she could keep up appearances. I moved the cursor over the active payment profile. I clicked the button to cancel the recurring draft. A warning prompt asked if I was sure, explaining that missed payments would result in immediate vehicle repossession. I clicked confirm. The payment vanished from the screen. By next week, the bank would issue a recovery order, and her prized status symbol would be towed out of wherever they ended up sleeping. I moved down the list to the next major expense. It was a premium gold tier health insurance policy. A few years ago, Cameron had complained bitterly about the deductibles on his corporate health plan. He claimed it was beneath him to pay out of pocket for basic medical visits. Like always, I stepped in to smooth his path. I purchased a comprehensive private family policy for them, covering everything from boutique dental work to Brittany's expensive elective dermatology appointments. I paid the exorbitant monthly premium without a single complaint. I clicked on the insurance provider link and logged into the member portal. I did not just cancel the payment. I terminated the entire policy effective at midnight tonight. If Cameron bruised his knuckles hitting his next victim, he would have to pay for the ice pack out of his own empty pocket. The sheer volume of automatic payments I had set up over the years was staggering. I systematically went down the list, severing every single artery of financial support. I canceled the autopay for their premium grocery delivery service. I deleted the recurring payment that covered the expensive organic dog food for their purebred golden retriever. I even found the monthly subscription for the exclusive wine club Cameron used to stock his impressive home bar. I terminated them all. With every click of the mouse, another layer of their artificial wealth was stripped away. They thought they were living a life of luxury built on Cameron's corporate success. In reality, they were living on an allowance provided by the father they had just publicly abused. There was one final connection left to sever. I opened a new tab and logged into my telecommunications provider. Decades ago, when Cameron was just a teenager, I added his first cell phone to my family plan. Over the years, that plan had grown. Upgraded smartphones, unlimited data packages, international roaming for their lavish vacations. I was the primary account holder, and I paid the massive bill every single month. Earlier today, Brittany had used that very phone and the data plan I paid for to record my humiliation. She was probably sending that video to her friends right now, laughing at the old man who just sat there and took the abuse. I navigated to the device management page. 2 active lines were listed under my account, one for Cameron and one for Brittany. I selected both devices. A drop-down menu appeared offering various options like pausing data or suspending service temporarily. I ignored those options and scrolled to the very bottom. I selected the option for total permanent line cancellation. The system generated a final warning, stating that the phone numbers would be permanently lost and the devices would be immediately disconnected from the cellular network. I clicked the execute button. I looked at the digital clock on my laptop screen. It was exactly 8:45 in the evening. I imagined the scene back at the barbecue. The guests would be mingling under the string lights. Brittany would be holding her phone, preparing to post a picture or send a text message. Suddenly, the signal bars in the corner of her screen would vanish. The network icon would disappear. She would try to refresh her browser, but the screen would just load infinitely. She would tap Cameron on the shoulder, complaining about the terrible reception. He would pull out his own device only to find a completely dead connection. Within 3 minutes, they were entirely cut off from the digital world. They had no ability to make calls, send emails, or access their bank applications, unless they begged a neighbor for a wireless connection. I closed the laptop and pushed it away. The screen went dark, plunging the living room back into shadows. The entire process had taken less than 20 minutes. In that short window of time, I had completely dismantled the financial infrastructure of my son's life. He had no house. He had no car. He had no insurance. He had no phone. He was a wealthy man at 8 o'clock and a destitute man by 9. I stood up from the sofa and walked into the kitchen. I opened the high cabinet above the stove and took down a bottle of aged bourbon I had been saving for a special occasion. I poured a measure of the dark amber liquid into a simple glass. I did not add ice. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at my quiet neighborhood. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty road. I took a slow sip of the bourbon. It burned pleasantly as it went down, warming my chest. My fingers traced the outline of the bruise forming under my shirt where Cameron had struck me. The physical ache was still there, but the emotional weight that had suffocated me for years was completely gone. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I felt entirely peaceful. The financial execution was in motion, and there was nothing on earth Cameron could do to stop it. I placed my cell phone on the counter. I opened the settings menu and switched the device to absolute silent mode. No vibrations, no emergency alerts. I did not want to hear the frantic voicemails when they finally found a working phone. I drank the last drop of the bourbon and rinsed the glass in the sink. I turned off the kitchen lights and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. I pulled back the covers, climbed into bed, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 2 years, I slept through the entire night without waking up once. The weekend passed with exactly the kind of silence I had engineered. I did not receive any panicked phone calls because they had no network connection to make them. I spent Sunday reading a novel on my back porch, listening to the birds, and enjoying the profound peace of a man who has finally stopped carrying a crushing weight. But Monday morning arrived, and the real-world consequences of my Friday night keystrokes began to bleed into the daylight. At noon, Cameron was exactly where he felt most powerful. He was sitting in a private leather booth at the most exclusive steakhouse in the financial district. This was his arena. He was hosting 3 prospective clients for his new business venture, the very same venture he had demanded my life insurance money to fund. He had ordered the most expensive cuts of dry, aged beef and multiple bottles of imported red wine. He was holding court, laughing loudly and projecting the image of a wildly successful young executive who had the world on a string. He wanted these investors to believe he was a man of unlimited means, a man who could easily handle their capital. The lunch concluded, and the waiter brought the leather-bound checkbook to the table. The bill was easily in the thousands. Cameron did not even look at the itemized receipt. He smoothly pulled his premium corporate credit card from his designer wallet and placed it on the silver tray with a practiced smile. He continued telling a story to his guests, leaning back in his chair, while the waiter walked away to process the payment. For years, Cameron believed that credit card was a testament to his own corporate value. He thought the bank had issued him a massive spending limit because they recognized his earning potential. The truth was far less flattering. When he first landed his junior executive role, his credit was so abysmal the bank refused to issue him a company card. To save him from the embarrassment of telling his boss, I quietly stepped in. I linked his corporate account to my own pristine financial portfolio, acting as a silent guarantor. My flawless credit history was the invisible armor protecting his fragile ego. But on Friday night, I had completely dissolved that guarantor status. The armor was gone. The waiter returned to the table. He did not have the receipt for Cameron to sign. Instead, he leaned down and whispered discreetly that the transaction had been declined. Cameron scoffed. He confidently told the waiter to run it again, claiming their machine must be malfunctioning. The waiter politely explained that he had already tried 3 times, and the bank system had flagged the card as invalid. The casual atmosphere at the table instantly evaporated. The prospective client stopped talking and looked directly at Cameron. A flush of hot embarrassment crept up his neck. He reached for his pocket to grab his smartphone, intending to aggressively call his bank and demand an explanation in front of his guests. He pulled the device out and stared at the screen. The signal indicator was completely empty. He had no service. He could not make a call. He could not access his banking application. He was sitting in a 5-star restaurant with a massive bill, 3 wealthy investors watching him, and a useless piece of plastic in his hand. He was forced to excuse himself from the table, his face burning red as he walked to the front host stand to beg to use their landline telephone. While Cameron was experiencing his first taste of public humiliation, Brittany was 30 miles away, walking into a high-end day spa. She had booked a full morning of premium treatments: hot stone massages, organic facials, and a custom manicure. She spent 3 hours wrapped in a plush white robe, sipping cucumber water and ignoring the world. She believed she was living the life she was inherently entitled to. When her treatments were finished, she returned to the private dressing room to change back into her designer clothes. She pulled her phone from her purse, intending to post a picture of her fresh manicure to her social media accounts. Just like Cameron, she found a dead screen with no network connection. She assumed the thick walls of the spa were blocking the cellular signal. She opened the settings menu and connected to the complimentary wireless internet provided by the facility. The moment her phone established a connection to the internet, a chaotic flood of delayed notifications overwhelmed her screen. It was a cascade of financial disaster. Red alert banners popped up one after another. Overdraft warnings from her personal checking account. Final notices from her credit card providers. A repossession alert from the auto finance company. Her heart began to race. She quickly tapped on her primary banking application and logged in. The large number at the top of the screen, which usually brought her so much comfort, was currently displaying a negative balance of several $100s. She frantically checked the transaction history, looking for the monthly trust dividend. For years, a substantial sum of money had magically appeared in her account on the first Monday of every month. She and Cameron treated it like a guaranteed inheritance, an automatic right. She had no idea that dividend was simply a manual transfer I initiated from my own retirement savings to ensure she never overdrew her accounts. This morning, for the first time in 5 years, the phantom money had not arrived. Panic set in. She walked out to the elegant marble reception desk to settle her tab for the morning treatments. The receptionist smiled and ran her debit card. The machine beeped loudly, displaying a declined message. Brittany nervously handed over a second credit card. Declined. She tried a third. Declined. The line of wealthy women behind her began to murmur and shift uncomfortably. Brittany, the woman who loved to mock others for their lack of status, was now the center of a humiliating spectacle. The spa manager had to be called over. Brittany was forced to leave her expensive diamond tennis bracelet in the manager's desk as collateral, just so they would let her walk out the front door without calling the local police for theft of services. Back in the city, Cameron had finally reached the bank using the restaurant telephone. The automated system informed him that his guarantor had severed the connection and his account was locked due to lack of collateral. He slammed the phone down. He realized instantly what had happened. He remembered the blank look on my face at the barbecue when he had struck me 13 times. He realized the disconnected phones, the declined cards, and the missing money were all connected to the old man he thought he could push around. He did not return to his clients. He could not face them. He left them sitting at the table with the unpaid bill, effectively destroying his own business deal and his professional reputation in one cowardly move. He sprinted out of the restaurant and threw himself into his car. He merged onto the highway, driving recklessly over the speed limit, heading straight for the suburbs. He was furious. He was convinced that this was just a minor tantrum on my part. He fully intended to kick my door open, scream in my face, and force me to fix the mess I had made of his perfect Monday. He had absolutely no idea that the nightmare had not even truly begun. While my son was losing his mind in the suburbs, I was 30 floors above the city. Cameron had driven his car straight to my house. I could easily picture him marching up my front walkway with his fists clenched, ready to kick my door off its hinges. He probably pounded on the heavy oak door until his knuckles bruised. He would have shouted my name, expecting me to cower inside like a frightened animal. He probably cupped his hands against the living room window, trying to peer through the blinds, hoping to catch a glimpse of the old man he wanted to intimidate. But he only found an empty house. I was not there. I was not hiding. I was busy finalizing his absolute ruin. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom in the heart of the downtown financial district. The air conditioning hummed quietly, creating a sterile environment that perfectly matched the business at hand. The room smelled of expensive leather and polished mahogany. Sitting to my right was my attorney Fletcher. He was a meticulous man who charged a premium for his services and earned every single penny. Across the wide table sat the cash buyer. He was a commercial real estate developer whose entire business model revolved around aggressive acquisitions and distressed asset flipping. He did not care about the manicured lawns or the custom fire pits. He only cared about the profit margin. He was a shark wearing a tailored charcoal suit, and I had just thrown him a very bloody piece of meat. The developer had his own legal counsel sitting beside him, reviewing the digital transfer files. They knew this was a hostile takeover. I had made it perfectly clear during our initial phone call that the current occupants were entirely unaware of the sale and would likely be uncooperative. The developer did not care. He actually thrived on these exact scenarios. He explained to me that his firm handled corporate evictions on a weekly basis. They had dedicated teams who specialized in removing stubborn tenants and securing high-value properties before any damage could be done to the interior. He looked at the property portfolio with hungry eyes, calculating exactly how much he could make by gutting the luxury kitchen and subdividing the expansive lot. Fletcher opened a thick leather binder and extracted a stack of legal documents. These were not standard residential sale forms. These were commercial entity transfer agreements. By signing these papers, I was not just selling a house. I was transferring the entire holding company that owned the property directly to the developer. It was a clean, surgical severing of all my ties to the land and the structure sitting on it. Fletcher slid the crisp white pages across the polished wood table. He handed me a heavy gold pen. He looked at me for a brief moment, silently asking if I was absolutely sure about this irreversible decision. I did not hesitate. I took the pen and smoothed out the paper. I signed my name on the first line. I thought about the first time I held Cameron when he was born. I signed the second line. I thought about the years I spent working overtime just to pay for his college tuition so he could secure his corporate job. I signed the third line. I thought about the vicious strikes against my chest and the laughter of his wife. With every stroke of the pen, I erased another memory. I was not just selling real estate. I was evicting my son from my heart. I finished the final signature and pushed the documents back across the table. The developer smiled. He picked up the paperwork and handed it to his own attorney, who quickly verified the signatures and applied his notary stamp. The heavy thud of the stamp echoing in the quiet boardroom was the sound of the guillotine falling. The developer pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. He was authorizing the wire transfer. My bank account was linked directly to the holding company. We sat in silence for exactly 3 minutes. Then my own phone vibrated softly against the table. I looked at the screen. A digital notification from my bank confirmed that a massive 7-figure sum had just successfully cleared into my primary account. The transaction was complete. The money was real and the house was legally gone. The developer did not waste a single second. The moment the wire transfer was confirmed, he made a phone call to his logistics coordinator. I sat and listened as he orchestrated the immediate seizure of the property. He spoke in sharp, efficient commands. He ordered a heavy-duty disposal dumpster to be delivered to the driveway within the hour. He dispatched a private security firm consisting of off-duty law enforcement officers to secure the perimeter of the estate. He instructed a professional locksmith crew to drill out every single deadbolt and install high-security commercial locks on all the exterior doors. He specifically told the security team leader that the previous occupants had no legal rights to the property and were to be treated as hostile trespassers. If they resisted, the security team was authorized to call the local police and press criminal charges for trespassing on private commercial property. The developer hung up the phone and stood up from the table. He extended his hand toward me. He told me it was a pleasure doing business and assured me his team would have the property fully locked down by the afternoon. I shook his hand. It was a firm, cold handshake between two men who understood the ruthless nature of business. Fletcher began packing the copies of the transfer documents into his leather briefcase. He asked me if I needed a ride back to my truck. I told him I was perfectly fine. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling city below. Somewhere down there, my son was speeding through traffic, completely unaware that his kingdom had just been conquered by a man in a charcoal suit. He was probably planning out exactly what he was going to say to me when he finally tracked me down. He was probably practicing his angry demands and his cruel insults, but he had no leverage left. The bank cards were useless. The phones were dead. And now the very house he intended to return to was surrounded by armed men who answered to a corporate entity that did not care about his feelings or his social status. The developer and his lawyers left the boardroom, leaving Fletcher and me alone. Fletcher closed his briefcase and told me that from a legal standpoint, I was completely insulated. The limited liability company was gone. The title was clear. There was absolutely no way Cameron could reverse the sale or claim any rights to the equity. He was effectively a ghost haunting a house that belonged to a stranger. I thanked Fletcher for his meticulous work. I left the high-rise building and walked out into the warm afternoon sun. I decided to take a slow walk through the city park before heading home. I watched families having picnics and children playing on the grass. I felt a profound sense of relief washing over me. The heavy chains of obligation that had bound me to an abusive son were finally broken. I had spent my entire life building a safety net for a boy who only wanted to use it to strangle me. Now the net was gone. He was in free fall, and the ground was approaching faster than he could possibly comprehend. While I was taking that peaceful walk, Cameron had finally reached my house. I found out later from a neighbor that he had caused a massive scene on my front porch. He was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, screaming my name and kicking the bottom of my front door. He was completely out of control. He walked around to the backyard, peering through the windows of my kitchen, trying to spot any sign of movement. He even tried to force open the sliding glass door, but I had placed a heavy wooden dowel in the track specifically to keep him out. He stood on my patio, surrounded by the silence of an empty house, completely unable to comprehend that his punching bag had simply vanished. He eventually gave up and stomped back to his car. He merged onto the road, heading back to his own suburban fortress. He believed he could just retreat to his castle and regroup. He did not know the castle had already been raided. The afternoon sun beat down on the suburban street, casting long shadows across the pristine asphalt. I was not there to witness the exact moment my son realized his kingdom had fallen, but the lead security contractor provided Fletcher with a comprehensive incident report and high-definition body camera footage of the entire encounter. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the tree-lined street of that exclusive neighborhood had become a theater of absolute humiliation. Cameron turned his car onto his street, driving recklessly fast, desperate to find the safety of his own garage after his public disgrace at the steakhouse. He slammed on the brakes, leaving black skid marks on the pavement, when he saw the chaos unfolding on his property. A taxicab pulled up right behind him. Brittany stepped out of the back seat, looking disheveled and frantic, having been forced to leave her diamond bracelet at the spa just to pay for the ride home. They converged on the sidewalk and stared at the nightmare I had legally constructed for them. The beautiful custom wrought iron gates that guarded the driveway were tightly wrapped in thick industrial steel chains, secured by a massive solid brass padlock. Parked directly on the imported paving stones of the driveway was a massive commercial roll-off dumpster. The air was filled with the loud grinding noise of diesel engines and heavy machinery. A crew of workers in bright yellow vests was actively tearing up the front lawn. The expensive imported rose bushes Brittany loved to show off to her neighbors were being ripped out by their roots and tossed carelessly into the rusted metal bin. The developer was wasting no time stripping the property down to its bare commercial value. Standing on the front porch, blocking the heavy double doors, were 3 private security contractors. They were not neighborhood watch volunteers or local patrolmen. They were large, muscular men wearing dark tactical clothing, heavy boots, and utility belts. They stood with their hands clasped calmly in front of them, completely unfazed by the destruction happening around them. They were paid exceptionally well to stand exactly there and prevent unauthorized access to the developer's new asset. Cameron snapped. He could not process the visual information in front of him. His brain refused to accept that his sanctuary was being dismantled. He stormed up the driveway, his face flushed dark purple with rage. He bypassed the landscaping crew and marched straight toward the porch, waving his arms wildly. He demanded that the men step away from his front door immediately. He shouted that he was the legal homeowner and that they were committing a felony by trespassing on his land. The 3 men did not move a single inch. They did not even adjust their posture. When his demands were met with total silence, Cameron escalated his threats. He puffed out his chest and screamed that he had a firearm inside the house. He swore he would break the chain, kick the door down, and shoot every single one of them for invading his property. It was a foolish, desperate bluff from a man who had never been in a real physical altercation in his entire life. The lead security contractor, a man with a thick neck and a completely expressionless face, finally stepped forward. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a crisp white clipboard holding a stack of legally binding documents. The contractor walked down the porch steps and stopped on the other side of the chained gate. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in a flat, authoritative tone, informing Cameron that threatening armed security personnel on private commercial property was a fast track to a federal prison sentence. He then slid the clipboard through the gap in the iron gate and instructed Cameron to read the top page. Cameron snatched the clipboard, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He stared at the paper. It was an immediate commercial eviction notice drafted and stamped by the county court. Attached directly behind it was the deed transfer I had signed just hours ago in the downtown boardroom. Cameron read the name of the limited liability company that had previously owned the house. He recognized the corporate address listed next to it. It was my home address. Then he read the name of the new owner, the downtown development firm. Brittany pushed her way past Cameron and looked over his shoulder. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon. The terrible truth finally crashed down on both of them. They never owned the home. They never held the deed. The mortgage they had been paying for 5 years was nothing more than a glorified rental agreement. They were tenants living on my absolute mercy, and I had just terminated their lease. Brittany let out a sharp gasp, realizing that the house, the manicured lawn, the custom kitchen, and every ounce of social status tied to this address was a complete illusion. The man she had laughed at while he was being assaulted had secretly owned every square inch of her perfect life. Cameron dropped the clipboard onto the grass. The false bravado completely drained from his body, leaving him hollow and trembling. He looked up at the contractor and tried to change his tactic, pleading for just a little bit of time. He begged them to stop the landscaping crew and let him make some phone calls. He promised he could clear up the misunderstanding if he could just get inside and access his computer. The contractor shook his head. He informed Cameron that the property belonged to the developer now, and the demolition schedule was already set. However, the contractor explained that state law required them to allow the previous occupants a brief window to retrieve essential personal belongings before the interior liquidation began. He reached over the gate and dropped 2 heavy-duty black plastic contractor bags onto the driveway at Cameron's feet. The rules were simple and brutal. They had exactly 15 minutes to go inside. They could only take whatever they could physically fit into those 2 bags. Everything else left inside the house, furniture, electronics, designer clothes, would become the legal property of the development firm to be sold or thrown into the dumpster. The contractor unlocked the heavy brass padlock and pulled the steel chain away from the gate. He gestured for them to proceed. Cameron and Brittany grabbed the plastic bags and ran up the steps, their hearts pounding with sheer panic. The 3 armed guards followed them inside, watching their every move to ensure they did not attempt to damage the walls or steal any permanent fixtures. The 15 minutes inside the house were a psychological torture of their own making. The vast interior suddenly felt like a massive trap. They ran up the curved wooden staircase, slipping on the polished floors. Brittany sprinted into her massive walk-in closet, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of her belongings. She had racks of expensive dresses, dozens of imported shoes, and shelves of designer handbags. She grabbed handfuls of clothes and shoved them into the black plastic bag, crying hysterically as she was forced to choose between a winter coat and her favorite silk blouses. Cameron ran into his home office, sweeping his arms across his desk. He shoved his laptop, his important tax documents, and a few framed awards into his bag. He tried to grab a heavy bronze statue he had bought to impress his clients, but the guard standing in the doorway firmly instructed him to put it down, citing it as a decorative asset, now belonging to the firm. Cameron was forced to drop the statue. He moved to the bedroom, dumping his expensive watches and whatever cash he had hidden in his nightstand into the bottom of the plastic sack. The ticking of the clock was relentless. Every time they tried to pause and think, the lead contractor loudly announced the remaining time. 5 minutes. 3 minutes. 1 minute. They were running through their own home like frightened scavengers, desperately trying to salvage fragments of a life that no longer existed. When the 15 minutes expired, the contractors did not give them a single second of grace. They ordered Cameron and Brittany to step away from their dressers and move toward the front door. Brittany sobbed, begging to take just one more bag of shoes. The guard ignored her, physically stepping between her and the closet. They were marched back down the grand staircase, carrying their black plastic garbage bags over their shoulders, looking like common transients. They walked out the front door and stepped onto the porch. The lead contractor pulled the heavy wooden doors shut. The sound of the deadbolts locking echoed loudly across the ruined front lawn. The guards escorted them back down the driveway and past the iron gates. The steel chain was wrapped around the bars once again, and the brass padlock was snapped shut, locking them out forever. They stood on the public sidewalk holding their garbage bags while the landscaping crew continued to feed the remaining rose bushes into the metal dumpster. They were completely locked out of the illusion they had built. Cameron was a man who had never been told no by the universe. Even standing on the public sidewalk, with his entire life stuffed into 2 black plastic garbage bags, his ego absolutely refused to accept the reality of the situation. He was convinced there was a loophole, a mistake a manager he could scream at to fix the massive problem unfolding in front of his eyes. Since I had permanently severed his cellular service, he had no way to call for help from his own device. He grabbed Brittany by the arm, pulling her away from the chained gate, and marched her down the manicured sidewalk toward the massive house next door. This house belonged to his cousin, a man who just 48 hours ago had stood on the patio holding a beer and watched Cameron violently jab his finger into my chest without saying a single word. Cameron pounded his fist against the ornate glass of his cousin's front door, hitting it hard enough to rattle the frame. He did not ask for a favor when the door finally opened. He demanded access. He pushed his way into the grand foyer, brushing past his own family members, who looked at him with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. He snatched the landline telephone from the kitchen counter and dialed emergency services. He did not tell the dispatcher that he was involved in a civil property dispute with a corporate landlord. He knew the police would not rush over for a simple tenant issue. Instead, he fabricated a highly dangerous lie. He told the operator that heavily armed mercenaries had invaded his home, locked him out, and were currently holding his property hostage. He claimed his wife was terrified and that their lives were in immediate danger. He hung up the phone feeling incredibly smug. He believed he had just outsmarted the system utilizing his corporate ruthlessness. He fully expected the police to arrive, draw their weapons, and force the security contractors to hand back his keys. Less than 5 minutes later, the quiet suburban atmosphere was violently shattered by the piercing sound of approaching sirens. 2 local police cruisers sped around the corner, their red and blue emergency lights reflecting off the pristine windows of the expensive homes. They skidded to a halt, aggressively blocking the street right in front of the chained gates of the property. 4 officers jumped out of the vehicles, moving with intense tactical precision. They kept their hands resting heavily on their holstered duty weapons, completely prepared to walk into a violent, active hostage situation. Cameron immediately ran toward the officers, waving his arms and pointing frantically at the 3 security contractors standing perfectly still on the porch. He put on a spectacular performance, playing the role of the terrified, wealthy homeowner who was being maliciously victimized by corporate thugs. He demanded the officers arrest the men for breaking and entering, armed robbery, and trespassing. The officers approached the gates with extreme caution, instructing everyone on the sidewalk to stay exactly where they were. The lead security contractor did not flinch. He did not reach for his radio or make any sudden aggressive movements. He calmly stated his name, his state security licensing number, and his exact legal purpose for being on the property. He then slowly reached through the gaps in the iron bars and offered the officers the exact same white clipboard he had shown Cameron minutes earlier. The senior police officer took the clipboard, stepping back to maintain a safe distance. He read the commercial eviction notice drafted by the county court. He examined the stamped deed transfer. He saw the official seal and the signature of the downtown commercial developer. The physical tension in the officer's shoulders immediately dropped. He realized he was not walking into an armed robbery. He was walking into a routine corporate lockout. The officer turned away from the gate and walked back toward Cameron. He asked for a valid driver's license. Cameron confidently pulled out his designer wallet and handed over his identification, eagerly pointing out that his home address was printed right there on the plastic card. The officer nodded, acknowledging the address, but then asked a devastating legal question. He asked Cameron to produce a single piece of paper, a recent mortgage statement, a property tax receipt, or a registered deed proving he actually owned the land beneath his feet. Cameron stuttered. He tried to explain the complex financial arrangement we had utilized for the past 5 years. He tried to explain that his father was the holding company, and that I had maliciously sold it out from under him to punish him. The officer held up his hand, stopping the frantic, disjointed explanation. He explained the cold, hard truth of the law to a man who thought he was above it. The printed address on a driver's license only proves residency. It does not prove ownership. The legally binding documents on the clipboard proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the limited liability company owned the house, and that company had just been legally sold to a new corporate entity. The officer's tone shifted from protective to completely rigid and uncompromising. He informed Cameron that this was entirely a civil matter. The police department had absolutely no jurisdiction to overturn a corporate property transfer or enforce a verbal family lease agreement. Furthermore, the officer sternly warned Cameron about the severe criminal consequences of his recent actions. He told him that calling emergency services and fabricating a story about armed mercenaries to manipulate a rapid police response was a serious criminal offense. Cameron tried to argue, utilizing the same aggressive tactics he used in the boardroom. He raised his voice, insisting that his civil rights were being violated and demanding to speak to a police supervisor immediately. He was still desperately trying to bully his way out of a situation that required legal leverage he simply did not possess. The senior officer had absolutely no patience for a spoiled executive throwing a childish tantrum on a public street. He unclipped his radio and stepped directly into Cameron's personal space towering over him. The officer delivered a final, non-negotiable ultimatum. He pointed his finger down the length of the block. He told Cameron that he had exactly 10 seconds to pick up his trash bags and walk away from the property boundary. If he stepped one single foot onto the grass, or if he continued to cause a public disturbance, the officer promised to arrest him on the spot for criminal trespassing and filing a false police report. The officer placed his hand firmly over the steel handcuffs attached to his heavy leather belt, making it perfectly clear that this was not a negotiation, but a direct legal order. The crushing reality of the physical threat finally penetrated Cameron's thick arrogance. He looked at the police officers standing firm against him. He looked at the heavy steel chains securing the massive iron gate. Then he looked around at the neighboring houses. The street was completely silent, but the expansive windows were not empty. The heavy curtains of the surrounding homes were pulled back just enough to reveal the faces of our extended family. The aunts, the cousins, the nephews. The exact same people who had happily eaten my expensive food, drank his premium alcohol, and watched him strike me in the chest without raising a single finger to intervene. They were all watching him right now. They were watching the golden boy of the family, the successful corporate genius, being treated like a common criminal by the local police. They were watching his beautiful wife standing on the concrete sidewalk with ruined makeup running down her face. Not a single front door opened to offer sanctuary. Not a single relative walked out to offer them a glass of water, a ride to a local hotel, or a place to sleep for the night. They stayed securely hidden behind their glass windows, silently witnessing the spectacular public collapse of his fake empire. They had chosen his side when he was powerful, and now they were abandoning him when he was weak. Cameron swallowed hard. His face was entirely pale, and his hands were physically trembling from the adrenaline crash. He bent down and picked up the heavy black plastic garbage bag containing his laptops and his broken pride. Brittany silently picked up her bag of wrinkled designer clothes, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Without saying another word, they turned their backs on the massive house they thought they owned. They began the long, agonizingly humiliating walk down the wealthy suburban street, dragging their plastic bags across the rough concrete. They were completely exposed, entirely defenseless, and utterly alone. And the most beautiful part of it all was that they had engineered this precise moment of destruction entirely by themselves. The humiliation on the suburban sidewalk was only the prologue to their nightmare. After the police ordered them to leave, my son and his wife dragged their heavy black garbage bags down the street until they reached a commercial boulevard. They had no working cell phones to call a taxi. They had no valid credit cards to book a luxury suite downtown. They were forced to walk 2 miles in the fading afternoon heat. The handles of the cheap plastic bags stretched and tore under the weight of their salvaged belongings. Designer shoes and expensive laptops scraped against the hot asphalt. They finally reached a rundown roadside motel that catered to transients and hourly guests. The neon sign out front was buzzing loudly with half the letters burned out. Cameron had to walk into the dingy lobby smelling of stale beer and desperation and empty his pockets. He used the last crumpled bills he had scavenged from his nightstand just to secure a single room for the night. The room smelled of old cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The carpet was stained with unknown substances, and the single mattress sagged heavily in the middle. For a couple who had spent the last 5 years sleeping on imported Egyptian cotton and bathing in a custom marble shower, this squalid box was a psychological prison. The shock of the public eviction finally wore off, and the adrenaline was immediately replaced by a toxic, suffocating panic. The tiny room became an intense pressure cooker. There was no space for Cameron to pace. There was no grand patio for him to stand on and project his fake authority. There was only a stained armchair, a flickering television, and a mirror that reflected the pathetic reality of his situation. The marriage fractured instantly. A relationship built entirely on the foundation of my stolen wealth could not survive a single hour of actual poverty. Cameron needed a scapegoat. His massive ego simply could not process that his own arrogant actions had caused this absolute destruction. He turned his rage entirely onto his wife. He stood in the middle of that filthy room and violently blamed Brittany for everything. He screamed that her endless shopping sprees, her obsession with country club status, and her constant need to impress her wealthy friends had completely drained his bank accounts. He accused her of being a selfish parasite who had ruined his pristine financial standing. He completely ignored his own terrible credit history, his failed investments, and his own lavish spending habits. He desperately wanted her to carry the blame so he could remain the flawless victim in his own twisted mind. He pointed his finger at her the exact same way he had pointed his finger at my chest just hours earlier. He demanded to know where all the money had gone. He yelled that if she had not spent so much on designer clothes, luxury vacations, and weekly spa treatments, they would have enough cash to hire a high-powered lawyer and fight the corporate eviction. He backed her against the peeling wallpaper of the motel room, hurling insults and degrading her exactly as he had done to me. But Brittany was not a grieving father, willing to sit silently and absorb his abuse. Brittany was a cornered animal, and she had sharp claws of her own. She snapped. She pushed him away with both hands and screamed right back into his face. Her voice echoed loudly through the paper-thin walls of the motel. She told him he was a complete failure as a provider and a massive fraud as a husband. She reminded him that he was the one who insisted on the expensive steakhouse dinners and the imported scotch just to look important. Then the immense pressure of the moment forced a devastating truth out of her mouth. She screamed a confession that completely paralyzed my son. She admitted that 6 months ago their finances were already secretly collapsing. Cameron's new business venture was burning through cash at an alarming rate, and his corporate salary was nowhere near enough to maintain their wealthy facade. Instead of cutting back and living within their actual means, Brittany had taken matters into her own hands. She confessed that she had taken out a massive off-the-books loan to keep their lifestyle afloat. She had borrowed $80,000 in cold, hard cash. But she did not go to a bank or a legitimate lending institution because their credit was entirely useless. She went to aggressive private lenders, the kind of ruthless men who operate entirely in the shadows and charge extortionate weekly interest rates. The kind of men who do not send polite warning letters when a payment is missed. Cameron stood completely frozen, staring at his wife in sheer horror. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a creeping dread. He stammered, asking her what she could possibly have used to secure such a massive sum of unregulated money. Brittany laughed, a bitter, hysterical laugh, wiping the ruined makeup from her cheeks. She told him she used the only high-value asset they possessed. She used the house. She had forged the necessary preliminary paperwork and utility bills to show the private lenders that they held clear title to a premium suburban property. The lenders had accepted the colonial home as ironclad collateral for the $80,000, fully believing that if the couple ever defaulted, they could force a legal lien on the property and extract their money by force. The terrifying reality of their situation crashed down on Cameron with the physical force of a freight train. The house was not just their shelter anymore. It was the only thing standing between them and incredibly dangerous people. And now the house was gone. The collateral had vanished into thin air, transferred legally and permanently to a commercial developer who had an army of corporate lawyers and armed guards. The $80,000 loan was now entirely unsecured. Cameron stumbled backward and sat down heavily on the edge of the stained mattress, kicking up a cloud of dust. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He knew exactly what this meant. Brittany had missed the current monthly payment because I had cut off the silent trust dividend she relied on earlier that morning. The lenders were already actively looking for their money. They would go to the suburban house first, only to find a locked steel gate and a commercial demolition crew. They would quickly discover that the collateral was a total illusion and that they had been brazenly defrauded. When aggressive, unregulated lenders realize they have been cheated, they do not file a lawsuit in civil court. They seek immediate physical retribution. Brittany stood in this corner of the room crying uncontrollably, but she delivered the final, crushing blow to his fragile reality. She took a deep breath and told Cameron that the lenders had required a verified emergency contact and a physical place of employment before handing over the briefcases of cash. She had given them the exact address of his downtown corporate office. She had given them his direct department floor, his specific cubicle location, and his personal extension number. The people who held an $80,000 violent grudge knew exactly where he worked. They knew his daily schedule. They knew exactly where to find him when the sun came up tomorrow morning. My son sat in that squalid motel room, completely trapped in a nightmare of his own creation. He had no cell phone to call the police for protection. He had no money to buy a plane ticket and flee the city. He had no secure house to hide inside. He was entirely exposed to the elements of his own arrogance. He realized that tomorrow morning he could not just skip work because his entire identity and his last remaining hope for income was tied to his corporate job. But walking into that high-rise office building meant walking directly into the waiting hands of ruthless debt collectors. I learned all of these precise details later from the private investigator my lawyer Fletcher had hired to monitor the fallout. Reading the transcript of their motel fight brought me absolutely no joy, but it brought me a profound sense of justice. Cameron had spent his entire adult life acting like the smartest man in every room, treating me like a disposable stepping stone. He thought he could abuse me without any consequences because I was his father. He forgot that a father is the one person who knows exactly how fragile a son truly is. He was about to learn that the real world does not care about his corporate titles or his expensive suits. The real world demands payment, and my son was completely bankrupt. The drive away from the subdivision took exactly 22 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in absolute silence, watching the suburban landscape shift from the manicured lawns of my son's neighborhood to the older, more established streets where I lived. My chest still throbbed where Cameron had driven his finger into my ribs, but the physical pain was entirely secondary to the cold, terrifying clarity that had taken over my mind. For years, I had operated under the delusion that unconditional love meant unconditional forgiveness. I had excused his arrogance as ambition. I had overlooked his disrespect as stress from his corporate job. I had allowed him to treat me like a burden because I wanted to protect the fragile bond we had left after his mother died. That delusion perished on his patio. Tuesday morning arrived with the cruel indifference of a rising sun. Cameron had spent the entire night staring at the water-stained ceiling of that roadside motel. He had not slept a single minute. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and smelled faintly of the stale cigarette smoke that permeated the cheap room. He had no fresh shirt to wear and no hot water to properly shave. But he forced himself out of that sagging bed and drove to the downtown financial district. His corporate job was the absolute last piece of his false identity still intact. It was also his only remaining source of income. He walked into the towering glass and steel building desperately trying to project his usual aura of arrogant success. He rode the elevator to the 50th floor, straightened his tie, and walked onto the expansive, open-concept sales floor. He sat down at his desk and picked up his office phone. He believed that if he could just close one massive deal, he could generate enough commission to start digging his way out of the grave I had dug for him. He was completely blind to the fact that the sharks were already in the building. Down in the pristine marble lobby of the corporate tower, two men walked through the revolving glass doors. They did not belong in this environment of high finance and polished luxury. They wore cheap, ill-fitting suits that hung awkwardly on their heavy frames. The fabric looked shiny and cheap under the bright lobby lights. Thick, dark ink crept out from beneath their shirt collars, extending up the sides of their thick necks. They walked with the heavy, deliberate steps of men who made their living through physical intimidation. The young receptionist, sitting behind the curved mahogany desk, immediately sensed the danger. She stood up and politely asked them to sign the visitor log and state their business. The two men did not even look at her. They completely ignored her polite requests and kept walking straight toward the secure elevator banks. When an unsuspecting junior analyst swiped his badge to open the glass security turnstiles, the two men simply grabbed the heavy glass partitions and forced their way through right behind him. The receptionist frantically picked up her phone to call building security, but the men were already in the elevator, riding up to the 50th floor. Up on the sales floor, the atmosphere was one of quiet, intense productivity. Dozens of executives sat in their modern glass-walled cubicles, speaking in hushed tones to wealthy clients. The floor was completely open, designed to foster a collaborative corporate culture. There were no solid walls to hide behind. Cameron was sitting at his desk, desperately trying to salvage the client relationship he had ruined at the steakhouse the day before. He was sweating, apologizing profusely into the receiver, and begging for a second chance to pitch his business proposal. He never saw the elevator doors open. He never saw the two heavy-set men step onto the plush carpet of the sales floor. The men did not wander aimlessly. Brittany had given them incredibly specific instructions to secure her loan. They knew exactly which aisle to walk down and exactly which desk belonged to my son. The sudden intrusion shattered the quiet hum of the office. The heavy footsteps of the two men drew the attention of every single employee they passed. They stopped directly in front of Cameron's desk. Cameron looked up from his computer screen, his eyes widening in sheer terror. He recognized the type of men they were immediately. The lead collector, a man with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, reached across the desk and violently snatched the telephone receiver right out of Cameron's hand. He did not bother hanging it up. He simply dropped it onto the floor, leaving the prospective client listening to the dead air. Cameron opened his mouth to speak, but the man slammed his heavy hands flat onto the polished surface of the desk, making a sound like a gunshot that echoed across the entire floor. Every single conversation in the room stopped instantly. Dozens of heads turned toward Cubicle 4. The lead collector did not care about corporate etiquette. He did not care about keeping his voice down. He spoke with a loud, booming volume, ensuring that every single person within 100 feet could hear exactly what he was saying. He looked down at Cameron and explicitly stated his full name. He then announced to the entire room that Cameron and his wife, Brittany, had brazenly defrauded his organization. He stated the exact amount of the debt loud and clear: $80,000. He told Cameron that the fake deed and the forged property documents they used to secure the cash had been discovered. He explained that the suburban house was gone and the loan was now entirely unsecured. Cameron was completely paralyzed. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. He looked around wildly, seeing the shocked faces of his colleagues, his rivals, and his subordinates. He tried to stand up. He raised his hands in a placating gesture and frantically whispered, begging the men to lower their voices. He pleaded with them to walk into a private glass conference room down the hall so they could discuss a payment plan quietly. The second tattooed man let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He stepped around the desk, invading Cameron's personal space. He grabbed the lapels of Cameron's wrinkled suit jacket and shoved him hard back into his expensive, ergonomic office chair. The lead collector leaned over the desk, placing his scarred face just inches away from my son. He told Cameron that there would be no private meetings and no restructured payment plans. He laid out the absolute final terms of their arrangement with chilling precision. He told Cameron that he had exactly 3 days. By Friday afternoon, at 5:00 sharp, a wire transfer for the full $80,000 plus an additional $10,000 in penalty interest had to clear their offshore account. If the money was not sitting in their bank by that exact minute, they would not return to this corporate office. They would find Cameron wherever he was sleeping. The man loudly and graphically described exactly what they would do to him. He explicitly threatened to shatter both of his kneecaps with a heavy steel pipe, ensuring he would never walk into a corporate boardroom ever again. The threat was not an empty boast. It was a guaranteed promise of extreme physical violence delivered in front of 50 witnesses. The heavy glass doors of the sales floor finally swung open. 3 uniformed corporate security guards burst into the room, rushing down the main aisle. They had their hands resting on their defensive gear, shouting for the 2 men to step away from the desk immediately. The debt collectors did not resist. They did not try to fight the guards. They had already achieved their primary objective. They had completely destroyed Cameron's safe space, humiliated him in front of his peers, and delivered their violent ultimatum. The lead collector let go of the desk and straightened his cheap suit jacket. He smiled a terrifying, predatory smile at Cameron, tapped his heavy wristwatch to indicate the ticking clock, and turned around. The 2 men willingly allowed the security guards to escort them off the floor, laughing loudly as they walked toward the elevators. The silence they left behind was absolutely deafening. The security guards disappeared into the elevator, leaving Cameron sitting alone at his desk. He was trembling so violently he could not even pick up the telephone receiver from the floor. He slowly looked up and saw the true extent of the damage. Every single employee on the floor was staring at him. But worse than the stares of his peers was the sight at the far end of the room. The senior management team, including the regional vice president and the director of human resources, had stepped out of their corner offices. They had witnessed the entire confrontation. They heard the massive amount of the debt. They heard the accusations of forgery and fraud. They heard the violent threats from men who clearly belonged to a dangerous syndicate. Cameron realized in that agonizing moment that his professional mask was permanently shattered. The golden boy image he had so carefully cultivated using my money was completely dead. He was no longer a rising corporate star. He was a massive liability, a man associated with violent criminals and unregulated debt. The vice president did not walk over to ask if he was okay. He simply gave Cameron a look of utter disgust, turned around, and walked straight toward the human resources department. Cameron sat in his chair, completely ruined, knowing that the absolute worst part of his day had only just begun. The silence on the sales floor after the debt collectors left was not a peaceful quiet. It was the suffocating silence of a graveyard. Cameron sat in his expensive ergonomic chair, entirely frozen, while the 50 other executives in the room stared at him. He did not have to wait long for the corporate machinery to process his public disgrace. Less than 2 minutes after the thugs stepped into the elevator, the executive assistant to the regional vice president walked slowly down the main aisle. She did not carry a notepad. She did not offer a polite greeting. She stopped directly in front of Cameron and told him that his presence was required in the Human Resources Department immediately. She did not ask him to bring his laptop or his current client files. She simply told him to stand up and walk. Cameron stood up on trembling legs. He felt the eyes of every single colleague tracking his movements. These were the men and women he had constantly tried to impress the people he had bragged to about his premium suburban estate and his flawless financial portfolio. Now they were watching him shuffle toward the executive suites like a condemned man walking to the gallows. He felt a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He desperately tried to formulate a plan, a persuasive corporate spin that could somehow explain away the violent threats and the $80,000 unregulated loan. He believed he could talk his way out of anything because my stolen money had always bought him a second chance. He was escorted into a pristine glass-walled office at the far end of the building. The room was freezing cold. Sitting behind a massive polished desk was the director of human resources, a severe woman who viewed employees entirely as assets or liabilities. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, with his arms crossed tightly, was the regional vice president. Cameron took a seat in the single chair positioned in front of the desk. He opened his mouth and tried to speak, attempting to apologize for the disruption and promising that the issue was just a minor personal misunderstanding. The human resources director raised her hand and silenced him instantly. She told him that there was absolutely nothing to discuss and that his employment with the firm was terminated effective immediately. Cameron gasped. He gripped the armrests of his chair, pleading for his job. He reminded them of his recent sales numbers and his dedication to the company. The vice president turned away from the window and looked at my son with absolute contempt. He explained that a prestigious financial institution manages millions of dollars in client capital. They operate on absolute trust and rigorous ethical standards. Having 2 heavily tattooed syndicate enforcers walk onto an open sales floor and publicly threaten to shatter a broker's kneecaps over a massive fraudulent debt is the ultimate catastrophic breach of their corporate morality clause. The vice president told Cameron that his mere presence in the building was a toxic liability. Desperate men drowning in unregulated debt are the exact type of employees who commit corporate embezzlement and client fraud. The company could not afford to let him near another financial ledger ever again. The human resources director slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a formal notice of termination with extreme cause. Because he was being fired for gross violations of the company ethics policy, he was completely stripped of his severance package. His unvested stock options were instantly canceled. His premium corporate health insurance was terminated on the spot. But the destruction of his career was not the end of the meeting. It was merely the opening act. The director opened a thick manila folder resting on her desk and pulled out a stack of printed credit card statements. She looked Cameron directly in the eyes and brought up the incident at the premium steakhouse the day before. She noted that his corporate card had been repeatedly declined in front of prospective clients, causing a massive embarrassment for the firm. She explained that when the accounting department looked into the issue, they discovered that the primary financial guarantor, his father, had completely severed ties and dissolved the backing account. This sudden loss of financial security, combined with the public revelation of his $80,000 shadow debt, triggered an automatic internal security protocol. The director leaned forward and delivered a blow that completely shattered whatever remaining sanity my son possessed. She informed him that the company was officially freezing his final paycheck and initiating a comprehensive forensic audit of his expense reports for the past 3 years. Every single client dinner, every premium flight, every luxury hotel stay he had charged to the company would be scrutinized by internal fraud investigators. The vice president stepped closer to the desk and laid out the terrifying stakes. He told Cameron that if the auditors found even a single dollar of misappropriated corporate funds or inflated personal expenses, they would not handle it internally. They would bundle the evidence and hand it directly over to the district attorney to pursue felony fraud charges. Cameron felt the room spinning. For years, he had treated his corporate expense account like a personal slush fund, loosely justifying lavish lunches and expensive drinks to maintain his wealthy facade. He knew exactly what the auditors would find. He realized that losing his job was no longer his biggest problem. His own reckless vanity had placed him directly in the crosshairs of a federal prison sentence. He tried to take a deep breath, but his lungs felt incredibly tight. The human resources director pressed a button on her desk phone, summoning building security. 2 uniformed guards entered the office. They did not ask Cameron to leave, they ordered him to stand. They confiscated his corporate identification badge, his secure access fob, and his company-issued smartphone. He was completely disconnected from the corporate network. The guards flanked him on both sides and marched him out of the human resources suite back onto the open sales floor. The entire department was completely silent, watching the final public degradation of a man who used to mock anyone who drove a cheaper car than he did. A flat, unfolded cardboard box was waiting on his desk. The security guards instructed him to pack his personal belongings and gave him exactly 3 minutes to do so. Cameron reached out with shaking hands. He had very little to take. The company owned the computer, the monitors, and the expensive leather chair. He packed a few high-end pens, a custom coffee mug, and a framed photograph of himself and Brittany smiling arrogantly on a luxury vacation I had secretly paid for. He placed the frame at the bottom of the box. He looked around at the faces of his colleagues, hoping to see a single expression of sympathy or support. Every single person averted their eyes. He was a ghost to them now. The guards instructed him to pick up the box and walk. He carried the cardboard container through the aisles, feeling the absolute crushing weight of his failure. He walked into the elevator, and the heavy steel doors closed, shutting out the corporate world forever. The ride down to the lobby felt like a descent into the deepest parts of hell. He stared at his own reflection in the polished metal doors. He looked completely broken, his shoulders slumped, and his face hollowed out by terror. He stepped out into the lobby and walked past the marble reception desk. The young woman sitting there watched him leave, knowing exactly why he was carrying that box. Cameron pushed his weight against the heavy revolving glass doors and stumbled out onto the bustling city sidewalk. The afternoon sun beat down on his shoulders. He stood on the concrete, surrounded by thousands of busy professionals rushing back to their secure jobs. He had nowhere to go. He could never work in the financial sector again, because his reputation was permanently destroyed and his record would soon be flagged for internal fraud. He had absolutely no money to his name. He had no house to return to. And the ticking clock established by the violent men who visited him was still running. He had 3 days to find $90,000, or his life would end in unimaginable physical pain. He was standing on the street, completely unemployable, entirely bankrupt, and profoundly alone. The invisible landlord he had abused had taken away his shelter and his survival, all without throwing a single punch. The sun set on Tuesday, leaving my son in total darkness, both literally and figuratively. He had spent the entire evening sitting on a wooden bench in a public park because he could not bear the thought of returning to the squalid motel room to face his furious wife. The ticking clock the debt collectors had established was hammering inside his skull with every heartbeat. He had roughly 72 hours to produce $90,000, or the violent men in the cheap suits would return to shatter his legs. He was completely out of options. He could not secure a bank loan. He could not ask his former colleagues for help. He had absolutely nothing left to sell. As the night deepened, the sheer terror of physical pain began to warp his mind. He descended into a state of absolute criminal desperation. His massive ego completely took over, rewriting the narrative to justify the unthinkable. He convinced himself that I was the villain of his story. He rationalized that my money was rightfully his, and that I was maliciously withholding the funds that could save his life. He remembered the substantial life insurance payout I had received after his mother passed away. It was the exact same pool of money he had publicly demanded at the barbecue just 3 days ago. He decided that asking was no longer an option. He was going to take it by force. He formulated a reckless plan fueled by panic and entitlement. He knew I kept my important financial documents, banking ledgers, and emergency checkbooks inside the heavy steel safe in my home office. He believed that if he could just get inside my house, he could physically corner me. He planned to wake me up in the middle of the night, intimidate me with the sheer force of his anger, and force me to write a massive check. If I refused, he intended to force me to log into my banking portal and initiate a direct wire transfer to his account. He was entirely prepared to cross the ultimate line from an abusive son to a violent home invader. At 2:00 in the morning, the suburban streets of my neighborhood were completely deserted. The only sound was the low hum of the streetlights, casting pools of pale yellow light onto the empty asphalt. Cameron drove his car into my subdivision, but he did not pull into my driveway. He parked 3 blocks away, pulling his vehicle into the shadows of a large oak tree. He turned off the engine and sat in the dark for several minutes, gathering his nerve. He stepped out of the car and began the long walk toward the house he grew up in. He kept his head down, avoiding the glowing cones of the streetlights, moving like a thief in the night. He reached the edge of my property and slipped silently through the side gate. He walked into the backyard, stepping carefully over the grass to avoid making any noise. He approached the rear of the house. Every single window was completely dark. He pressed his face against the glass of the kitchen door, trying to peer inside, but the heavy curtains were drawn shut. He reached for the handle of the sliding patio door and pulled, but it refused to budge. The heavy wooden dowel I had placed in the track held the door firmly closed. Cameron realized he could not simply pick a lock or force a door open. He needed to break the perimeter. He walked over to the edge of the patio and picked up a heavy decorative landscaping brick from the garden bed. He moved toward the small window of the laundry room located at the back corner of the house. He wrapped his hand in his suit jacket to muffle the sound and swung the heavy brick directly into the center of the glass pane. The glass shattered inward with a sharp, terrifying crash that sounded incredibly loud in the dead of night. Cameron froze, pressing his back against the brick wall of the house, waiting to see if alarms would sound or if lights would suddenly flick on. The neighborhood remained perfectly silent. He reached his hand through the jagged hole in the window, feeling around for the interior latch. A sharp piece of broken glass sliced deep into the palm of his hand. He hissed in pain, pulling his hand back to see dark blood welling up in the moonlight. He wiped the blood on his trousers, ignoring the stinging pain. He reached back inside, unfastened the latch, and shoved the window upward. He climbed awkwardly through the small opening, tumbling forward onto the linoleum floor of the laundry room. He was breathing heavily, his heart pounding with the massive adrenaline rush of committing a major felony. He stood up and brushed the shards of glass off his clothes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy pair of solid brass knuckles. He had purchased them years ago as a novelty item during a bachelor party, but tonight he slipped them over his fingers with malicious intent. He was entirely ready to use them against his own father. He stepped out of the laundry room and into the main hallway. He expected to hear the sound of my breathing or the creak of the floorboards as I got out of bed to investigate the noise. He heard absolutely nothing. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, using the screen as a dim flashlight to guide his way. He walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom, gripping the brass knuckles tightly. He reached out and pushed the bedroom door open, ready to shout his demands. He swept the dim light across the room and stopped dead in his tracks. The bedroom was completely empty. There was no bed. There were no dressers. The heavy oak nightstands were gone. The closet doors were wide open, revealing entirely bare shelves. He spun around, entirely confused. He ran back out into the hallway and moved toward the home office. He kicked the door open. The heavy steel safe was gone. The grand mahogany desk was gone. The bookshelves were completely stripped. Panic began to rise in his chest, replacing the violent adrenaline. He ran into the living room, the largest space in the house. He shined his phone light across the floor. The sofa, the television, the coffee table, the rugs, everything had been completely removed. The house was an empty, echoing shell. When I finalized the sale of his house with the commercial developer, I also realized that my own physical safety was completely compromised. I knew exactly how my son reacted when he was denied what he wanted. I had immediately hired a premium moving company to pack up my entire life on Monday morning. By Monday evening, I had completely vacated the premises, relocating to a secure, temporary residence that Cameron knew absolutely nothing about. Cameron stood in the center of the empty living room, listening to his own rapid breathing echoing off the bare walls. He realized I was gone and his massive, violent plan had completely evaporated into thin air. Then the beam of his phone light caught something sitting in the very center of the room. It was a single metal folding chair, the exact same type of cheap folding chair I had been sitting in at his barbecue when he assaulted me. He walked slowly toward the chair, completely bewildered. As he got closer, he noticed a small detail in the upper corner of the room, directly facing the chair. It was a high-definition security camera mounted securely to the wall, and right in the center of the black lens, a tiny red light was blinking steadily. Cameron stared at this blinking red light. The horrifying realization washed over him like a bucket of ice water. The house was not just empty, it was a trap. I had anticipated his exact level of desperation. I knew he would come looking for the money. I had instructed Fletcher to install the state-of-the-art night vision camera before I left. The camera was not recording to a local hard drive that Cameron could simply smash. It was connected to an independent cellular router, streaming high-definition video and audio directly to a secure legal server located in Fletcher's downtown law firm. Cameron looked down at his own hands. He was standing inside a house he had just broken into. His hand was bleeding profusely from the smashed window, leaving a trail of physical DNA directly to the point of entry. He was wearing brass knuckles demonstrating clear, premeditated, violent intent, and he was staring directly into a camera lens that was currently broadcasting his felony burglary to a server he could never reach. He had walked directly into the jaws of a legal bear trap, and the heavy steel teeth had just snapped shut around his ankle. He dropped the brass knuckles onto the hardwood floor, the heavy metal making a loud clattering sound in the empty room. He fell to his knees in the dark, finally understanding that he was completely and utterly defeated. Cameron remained kneeling on the bare hardwood floor of my former living room, completely mesmerized by the tiny blinking red light of the security camera. He did not know that the moment the glass of the laundry room window shattered, a sophisticated silent alarm had immediately triggered. I had not relied on a cheap standard alarm system that simply blares a loud siren to scare off teenage vandals. I had instructed Fletcher to hire a premium private security monitoring firm. The second the glass broke, a live high-definition feed of the interior was instantly transmitted to a dedicated dispatcher sitting in a secure facility miles away. The dispatcher saw a man covered in blood climbing through a broken window and immediately contacted the local police department, reporting a verified active burglary in progress. Because the burglary was confirmed via live video feed, the police response was instantaneous and overwhelming. The officers did not use their sirens. They did not want to spook the intruder and cause a dangerous hostage situation or a frantic foot chase through the dark neighborhood. 4 separate police cruisers glided into the subdivision with their headlights completely turned off. They moved like silent metal predators rolling to a stop at the edges of my property boundary. Heavily armed officers stepped out of the vehicles, gently clicking their car doors shut to avoid making any metallic sounds. They quickly fanned out, establishing a tactical perimeter that completely surrounded the house. They covered the backyard, the side gates, and the front driveway, blocking every conceivable escape route. Cameron was locked inside a heavily guarded box, and he had absolutely no idea. Inside the empty house, the adrenaline that had drained from Cameron suddenly flooded back into his veins, turning into sheer, unfiltered panic. He realized he had to get out of the house immediately, before anyone checked the camera footage. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished wood floor. In his blind haste, he reached down and grabbed the heavy, solid brass knuckles he had dropped moments earlier, shoving them deep into the pocket of his suit jacket. He thought he was just retrieving his personal property. He did not realize he was actively securing the exact piece of physical evidence that would guarantee a massive prison sentence. He ran back toward the hallway, breathing heavily, desperately looking for an exit. He considered going back through the laundry room window, but the jagged glass was covered in his own blood, and climbing out head first would be incredibly slow and dangerous. He ran into the kitchen and grabbed the handle of the sliding glass patio door, but the heavy wooden dowel I had jammed into the track refused to yield. He was trapped like a rat in a maze of his own making. The only viable exit was the heavy front door. He sprinted down the main corridor, his footsteps echoing loudly against the bare walls. He reached the entryway and grabbed the brass handle of the front door. He foolishly believed that if he could just get outside and disappear into the shadows, he could run the 3 blocks back to his parked car and escape into the night. He pulled the heavy wooden door open and stepped out onto the front porch. The absolute darkness of the peaceful suburban night was instantly obliterated. The moment his foot touched the concrete steps, 4 massive police floodlights flared to life simultaneously. They were mounted on the cruisers parked at the end of the driveway, and they completely blinded him. The intense white light washed over his wrinkled corporate suit, and his bleeding hand illuminating his crime for everyone to see. Before his eyes could even adjust, a chorus of deep, authoritative voices shattered the silence of the neighborhood. 3 officers were standing directly at the bottom of the porch steps with their duty weapons drawn and aimed directly at the center of his chest. Bright red laser sights painted glowing dots across his white dress shirt. The lead officer screamed for Cameron to raise his hands and step away from the door. Cameron was completely paralyzed by the sudden blinding ambush. He had lived his entire life in a pristine bubble of corporate privilege where conflicts were resolved with angry emails and passive-aggressive boardroom meetings. He had never faced the terrifying reality of lethal force. He dropped to his knees instantly, sobbing uncontrollably, raising his bleeding hands high above his head. He did not try to run. He did not try to argue or demand a police supervisor like he had done earlier that afternoon at his former estate. The raw, primal fear completely stripped away his arrogant facade. He was weeping like a terrified child, begging the officers not to shoot him. 2 officers rushed up the concrete steps, grabbing his arms and violently forcing him down flat onto his stomach. They pressed his face hard against the rough concrete of the porch, scraping his cheek. An officer planted a heavy knee between his shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground, while another officer forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, locking his hands together. They hauled him roughly to his feet, completely ignoring his whimpers of pain. They marched him down the driveway and shoved him hard against the warm metal hood of a police cruiser. The senior officer began conducting a thorough physical search incident to a felony arrest. He patted down Cameron's legs and torso, checking for concealed weapons or stolen property. The officer slid his gloved hand into the right pocket of Cameron's suit jacket. His fingers closed around the heavy, cold chunk of metal. The officer pulled his hand out and held the solid brass knuckles up under the glaring beam of the floodlights. The entire atmosphere among the police officers instantly shifted from a standard property crime response to an extreme high threat level. The senior officer looked at Cameron with absolute disgust. He informed my son that breaking a window to enter an empty dwelling was a standard burglary charge. But bringing a deadly blunt force weapon into a home invasion completely altered the legal landscape. The officer explicitly told Cameron that the brass knuckles demonstrated clear, premeditated intent to cause severe bodily harm or death to the occupant of the house. The criminal charges were immediately upgraded on the spot. He was no longer just being arrested for breaking and entering or property damage. He was now facing violent felony charges, including armed burglary and possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony. Cameron pressed his bruised face against the metal hood of the police car, weeping uncontrollably, as the officer read the catastrophic list of charges. The $80,000 unregulated debt, the ruined corporate career, and the lost suburban home were suddenly the least of his problems. He was going to a maximum security county jail immediately. Because he was charged with a violent armed felony, there would be absolutely no option for a quick bail release or a sympathetic judge. He had walked into the darkness hoping to violently steal his financial salvation, and he had walked directly into the absolute end of his life as a free man. I watched the entire event unfold the next morning on the secure video file Fletcher sent to my new laptop, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Wednesday morning brought a crisp breeze through the downtown financial district. I had just finished my final meeting with Fletcher, finalizing the irrevocable trust documents that would permanently secure my remaining assets. I walked out of his high-rise office building, feeling a profound sense of closure. Across the street sat a quiet, upscale European coffee shop. I decided to treat myself to a simple black coffee and a moment of reflection before returning to my new, secure residence. I took a seat at a small marble table near the front window, watching the city move past the glass. The anxiety that used to govern my daily routine was entirely gone. I was no longer waiting for the next financial disaster to hit my son. He was currently sitting in a concrete holding cell, waiting for a bail hearing that would never come. My moment of peace was violently interrupted exactly 12 minutes later. The heavy glass door of the coffee shop swung open with enough force to bang against the brass doorstop. The bell above the frame jingled frantically. I looked up from my cup. Standing in the entryway was Brittany. The transformation she had undergone in the past 48 hours was staggering. The woman who had glided across her custom patio in a designer sundress just 3 days ago was completely gone. Her expensive blonde hair was matted and tangled. She was wearing the same wrinkled clothes she had shoved into a garbage bag during the commercial eviction. Her face was pale, devoid of the premium cosmetics she usually layered on to face the world. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting from table to table until they finally locked onto me. She had obviously gone to Fletcher's office demanding to know my location, and one of his paralegals must have pointed her toward the cafe. She practically sprinted across the polished wooden floor. The quiet murmur of the wealthy patrons and the soft jazz playing over the speakers abruptly stopped. Dozens of people turned their heads to watch the frantic woman charging toward a quiet, elderly man. She did not pull up a chair. She did not attempt to have a civilized conversation. The moment she reached my table, her knees buckled. She collapsed directly onto the hard floor, throwing her hands onto the edge of my marble table and gasping for air. She began to sob hysterically. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, guttural wail that echoed off the high ceiling of the coffee shop. The barista behind the counter froze, holding a steaming pitcher of milk. The businessmen at the adjacent tables lowered their newspapers. Brittany did not care about the public spectacle. She was completely consumed by pure survival instinct. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, her mascara ruined and smeared across her cheeks. She begged me to save her life. She told me that Cameron had been arrested during the night and that he was facing years in a maximum security prison. She screamed that the private lenders, the men who held the unsecured $80,000 debt, knew exactly who she was. She told me they had already found the squalid motel room. She had barely managed to escape out the back door when they pounded on the frame early this morning. She was entirely alone, completely bankrupt, and being hunted by violent men who wanted their money immediately. She clamped her hands over mine, digging her fingernails into my skin, pleading for a wire transfer. She swore that if I just paid off the syndicate, she would disappear forever and never ask me for another dime. When the begging failed to elicit an immediate emotional response from me, she pivoted her strategy. She attempted to play the ultimate victim card. She looked around at the horrified patrons, trying to garner their sympathy before looking back into my eyes. She lowered her voice to a desperate whisper, claiming that she was never the enemy. She threw her own husband entirely under the bus without a second thought. She told me she had always been terrified of Cameron. She claimed his anger issues were out of control and that he forced her to take out that shadow loan to fund his failing business. She painted herself as a helpless hostage, trapped in a toxic marriage, forced to go along with his cruel treatment of me just to survive his temper. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, hoping my paternal instinct would override my logic, hoping I would see her as a frightened daughter who needed a savior. I sat perfectly still, allowing her to finish her elaborate performance. I gently pulled my hands out from under her desperate grip. I reached for my porcelain cup and took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. The dark roast was bitter and hot, offering a perfect grounding sensation. I placed the cup back onto the saucer, letting the ceramic clink softly in the silent room. I looked down at the woman kneeling in front of me. I did not feel an ounce of anger. I felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. I spoke to her in a voice so calm and quiet that she had to stop her sobbing just to hear me. I completely ignored her fabricated story about being a helpless victim. I transported her back to the 4th of July barbecue. I painted the picture for her using precise words. I reminded her of the exact angle of the afternoon sun. I reminded her of the smell of the grilled meat. I reminded her of the precise moment Cameron stepped into my personal space and began jabbing his finger violently into my chest. I watched the color completely drain from her already pale face as I recounted the event. I asked her if she remembered what she was doing, while my son struck me 13 separate times, while he called me a freeloader and a parasite. She stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. I answered the question for her. I told her she was standing by the outdoor kitchen, leaning against the expensive stone counter, leaning into the sunlight. I told her she was holding her premium smartphone up, with both hands perfectly framing the assault. And most importantly, I reminded her that she was smiling. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, closing the distance between us. I told her that she did not look terrified of her husband in that moment. She looked thoroughly entertained. I informed her that deleting the video from her phone yesterday morning was a completely useless gesture. I explained that my attorney, Fletcher, is a very thorough man. The moment the police arrested Cameron for the armed burglary last night, Fletcher contacted the district attorney and filed a massive elder abuse enhancement charge against my son. As part of that immediate legal filing, Fletcher subpoenaed the cloud backup servers attached to her cellular account. The police had already extracted the pristine, high-definition video of the entire assault. Brittany let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. I did not stop there. I explained the legal ramifications of her actions. I told her that the video did not just prove Cameron was a violent abuser. It proved that she stood by and enthusiastically documented a felony assault on an elderly man without attempting to intervene or call the authorities. I told her that the district attorney was currently preparing to serve her with accessory charges and criminal conspiracy for her role in the financial extortion attempt. She was not going to get a single dollar from me to pay off her loan sharks. She was going to face the brutal consequences of her $80,000 fraud completely alone. And when she finally stopped running from the men she owed money to, the local police would be waiting to put handcuffs on her for elder abuse. I looked down at her one last time. I told her that the absolute worst thing a person can do is mistake patience for weakness. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I placed it on the table to cover the cost of my coffee. I stood up from my chair, buttoning my suit jacket smoothly. Brittany remained completely collapsed on the coffee shop floor, her arms wrapped around her stomach, rocking back and forth in a state of total psychological shock. The patrons watched in stunned silence as I stepped around her. I did not look back. I walked out the front door, stepping into the bright morning sunlight, leaving her to drown in the shallow grave she had spent the last 5 years digging for me. The wheels of the criminal justice system turn incredibly slowly, but they grind with absolute precision. 6 agonizing months passed between the humid night my son was arrested on my front porch and the cold winter morning he finally faced his judgment. I walked into the county courthouse wearing a tailored charcoal suit, feeling entirely detached from the man sitting at the defense table. Cameron was no longer the golden boy of the corporate world. The expensive tailored suits he used to define his entire identity were gone, He was wearing an oversized, bright orange state-issued jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were secured with heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the wooden table every time he shifted his weight. His skin was paper white, entirely devoid of the confident tan he used to acquire on the luxury vacations I secretly funded. He looked small. He looked terrified. He looked exactly like a man who finally understood that his actions had irreversible consequences. The bailiff called my name, echoing across the high vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. I stood up from the gallery and walked slowly toward the witness stand. I did not look at Cameron as I passed his table. I placed my hand on the leather-bound book and swore to tell the absolute truth. I took my seat and adjusted the microphone. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp woman with no tolerance for domestic abusers, stood before me. She asked me to recount the events of the 4th of July barbecue. I did not cry. I did not let my voice tremble or show a single ounce of sorrow. I spoke with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a fatal tumor. I methodically detailed the exact sequence of events. I explained how Cameron cornered me on the patio, demanding my life insurance money to cover his failing business ventures. I described how he stepped into my personal space when I refused. Then I recounted the physical assault. I told the court exactly how he raised his right hand and drove his rigid index finger into my chest bone. I counted the strikes out loud for the court record. 1, 2, 3. I repeated the degrading insults he shouted with every single impact, calling me a freeloader and a parasite. 4, 5, 6. I described the sheer force of the blows pushing me backward into the folding chair, leaving a deep contusion over my heart. 7, 8, 9. The defense attorney attempted to raise an objection, claiming this was merely a heated verbal argument between a father and a son that got slightly out of hand. The prosecutor did not argue. She simply turned to the judge and introduced the state's primary piece of physical evidence. She requested permission to play the video footage subpoenaed directly from the cloud backup servers attached to Brittany's cellular account. Brittany had frantically deleted the file from her physical device the morning Cameron was arrested, hoping to erase her complicity. She did not understand that nothing is ever truly deleted from a corporate server, especially when an attorney like Fletcher knows exactly where to look. The courtroom lights were dimmed. A large monitor facing the jury box and the judge flickered to life. The high-definition video began to play. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as the footage filled the screen. Everyone watched my son loom over me, his face twisted with vicious anger. The microphone on the premium smartphone captured the audio with terrifying clarity. The entire room heard the loud, sickening thud of his finger striking my chest bone 13 separate times. They heard him explicitly threaten to throw me into a state-run psychiatric facility if I did not surrender my money. But the most damning part of the video was not Cameron's violence. It was the audio track beneath it. The clear, unmistakable sound of Brittany laughing. The video panned slightly, showing her reflection in the sliding glass door, holding the phone and smiling while her husband assaulted an elderly man. The visual evidence completely destroyed the defense attorney's narrative. This was not a family dispute. This was a documented malicious act of elder abuse recorded for entertainment. The lights came back on. The judge, a stern man with decades of experience on the bench, stared down at the defense table with pure, unadulterated disgust. Cameron was openly weeping into his chained hands, completely broken by the public broadcast of his true nature. The judge did not mince words when he delivered his ruling. He addressed Cameron directly, stating that in all his years presiding over criminal cases, he had rarely seen a defendant display such profound arrogance and cruelty toward his own flesh and blood. The judge systematically listed the severe aggravating factors: the documented physical elder abuse, the extortion attempt, the premeditated armed burglary involving a deadly weapon. The judge explained that bringing solid brass knuckles to a home invasion demonstrated a clear willingness to commit lethal violence to secure financial gain. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He stated that society must be protected from predators who believe their financial desires supersede human life. He handed down a massive consecutive sentence. For the armed burglary and the enhanced elder abuse charges, Cameron was sentenced to 7 full years in a maximum security state penitentiary. The judge explicitly mandated that the sentence would be served without the possibility of early parole or early release for good behavior. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block, sealing my son's fate. 2 large bailiffs immediately grabbed Cameron by the arms, hauling him to his feet. He did not look back at me. He simply hung his head and allowed them to drag him through the side door toward the holding cells, his heavy chains rattling the entire way. The trial was officially adjourned, but the absolute justice I had engineered was not quite finished. Brittany was sitting in the back row of the public gallery. She had attended the sentencing, hoping to silently observe the destruction of her husband. She believed she had successfully escaped the fallout by throwing him to the wolves and painting herself as a victim. She stood up, smoothing her cheap coat, entirely relieved that the ordeal was over. She turned to walk toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom, eager to disappear into the city and start finding a new source of income. She never made it into the hallway. Before her hand could even touch the brass handle, 2 plainclothes investigators from the district attorney's office stepped directly into her path. They blocked the exit completely. One investigator reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He handed it directly to her. Brittany took the envelope, her hands beginning to shake. The investigator spoke loud enough for the lingering reporters and the remaining gallery attendees to hear. He informed her that she was being officially served with multiple felony indictments. The district attorney had formally charged her with criminal conspiracy to commit extortion based on her active participation in the video recording. Furthermore, the Financial Crimes Division had finally traced the forged property documents she used to secure the $80,000 unregulated loan. She was being charged with massive wire fraud and grand larceny. The investigator informed her that a warrant for her arrest had been signed by a judge just 10 minutes ago. She was instructed to place her hands behind her back. Brittany dropped the manila envelope onto the polished floor. She let out a piercing scream, completely losing whatever composure she had left. She begged the investigators, claiming she had no money for a lawyer and that she would be killed by the private lenders if she was sent to jail. The investigators ignored her entirely. They snapped a pair of cold steel handcuffs around her wrists, securing them tightly. They marched her right back down the center aisle of the courtroom, Sir Frog, marching her past the empty defense table where her husband had just been condemned. I remained seated in the witness stand, watching her get dragged through the very same side door Cameron had disappeared behind. The snare I had set the day they locked me out of my own money had completely closed around both of them. They had walked into the courtroom believing they could outsmart the consequences of their arrogance. They both walked out in steel chains, completely ruined by the truth. 365 days have passed since the heavy wooden gavel fell inside that county courtroom. 1 full year since the heavy steel chains locked around the wrists of the people who believed they could abuse me without consequence. I do not live in the suburbs anymore. I left the manicured lawns, the neighborhood associations, and the toxic proximity to my former life far behind. I am standing on the expansive wraparound wooden deck of a newly purchased custom-built cabin. It sits high up in the mountains, completely secluded from the noise of the city. The air up here is incredibly thin and sharp, smelling of old pine needles and fresh cedar. Directly below my property lies a pristine alpine lake, its surface as smooth and reflective as a massive pane of dark blue glass. I am 64 years old today, and I have never felt healthier or more alive. The chronic tension that used to live in my shoulders, the constant underlying anxiety of managing my son's chaotic financial disasters, is entirely gone. The bruise on my chest faded a long time ago, but the lesson it taught me remains perfectly intact. I spend my mornings fishing on the quiet lake, and my evenings reading thick historical biographies by the massive stone fireplace in my living room. I do not have a television. I do not have a social media account. I have intentionally engineered a life of absolute profound silence. The sound of tires crunching slowly over the long gravel driveway breaks the afternoon quiet. I lean against the heavy wooden railing of the deck and watch a sleek, black luxury sedan pull to a stop near my truck. The driver's side door opens and Fletcher steps out. He looks entirely out of place, surrounded by towering pine trees, wearing his immaculate tailored city suit and holding his signature leather briefcase. But to me, he is a welcome sight. He is the architect who helped me design the perfect fortress. I walk down the wooden steps to greet him. We shake hands firmly. It is the handshake of two men who have successfully completed a long, complex, and highly satisfying campaign. I lead Fletcher up the stairs and invite him to sit at the heavy oak table positioned on the corner of the deck overlooking the water. The late afternoon sun casts long golden shadows across the wood. Fletcher does not waste time with unnecessary small talk. He knows exactly why he drove 2 hours up a winding mountain road. He places his briefcase flat on the table and snaps the brass locks open. He pulls out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. This is not a standard update on a legal proceeding. This is the absolute final chapter of my estate planning. We sit across from each other as he explains the precise legal mechanisms he has put into place. When the commercial developer purchased the suburban house last year, the massive 7-figure cash payout went directly into my primary holding account. For 12 months, that money has been sitting securely, generating substantial interest. But as long as it remained in my personal name, there was always a microscopic theoretical risk that a predatory lawyer might try to claim it years down the line. Fletcher has brought the documents to completely eliminate that risk forever. He slides the paperwork across the oak table. He explains that we are establishing a fortified, irrevocable trust. The word irrevocable is the most beautiful term in the entire legal dictionary. It means that once the ink dries on these pages, the transfer cannot be undone, modified, or challenged by anyone under any circumstances. I am taking the entire multi-million-dollar sum generated from the sale of my son's fake kingdom and locking it away permanently. But I am not keeping it for myself. I have more than enough money to live out my remaining decades in total comfort. I look at the designated beneficiary listed on the front page of the trust. It is the Regional Children's Hospital located downtown. It is a facility dedicated to treating pediatric oncology patients, families who are facing unimaginably cruel circumstances through absolutely no fault of their own. I am transferring the entirety of the house proceeds directly into their endowment fund. The money that my son demanded to fund his arrogant vanity project, the wealth he believed he was entitled to by blood, will now go toward buying advanced medical equipment and paying for the treatments of innocent children. Fletcher points to a specific clause buried deep within the legal text. He reads it aloud to me just to ensure I fully appreciate the ironclad nature of his work. The clause explicitly disinherits Cameron and Brittany by name. It legally defines them as hostile actors and completely strips them of any future rights to contest my estate when I eventually pass away. Fletcher tells me that even if Cameron serves his entire 7-year prison sentence and somehow manages to find a sleazy attorney willing to file a frivolous lawsuit, he will hit a solid brick wall. The money is legally completely out of his reach for the rest of eternity. I pick up the heavy gold pen resting on top of the documents. I look out over the pristine lake, watching a pair of eagles circling high above the water. I do not feel a single pang of regret. I do not mourn the loss of my legacy, because my true legacy is sitting right here on this table. I am not leaving behind a spoiled, violent heir. I am leaving behind a massive shield of protection for people who actually need it. I press the tip of the pen to the paper. I sign my name on the primary transfer line. I turn the page and sign the secondary authorizations. I initial the specific disinheritance clauses. With every stroke of the pen, I feel the remaining microscopic tethers to my past snapping completely. I push the finalized documents back across the table to Fletcher. He carefully inspects the signatures, applies his official notary stamp, and places the papers back into his leather briefcase. The legal execution is officially complete. There are no more accounts to close. There are no more assets to liquidate. There are no more hearings to attend. The board has been entirely cleared. Fletcher stands up and buttons his suit jacket. He declines my offer to stay for dinner, stating he needs to drive back down the mountain before it gets entirely dark. He shakes my hand one final time, looking me in the eyes, and telling me it has been an absolute privilege to represent me. I watch him walk down the stairs, get into his black sedan, and drive slowly away. The sound of the tires fades into the distance until the absolute silence of the mountain returns, wrapping around my cabin like a heavy protective blanket. I am completely alone. I have no son. The man who shares my DNA is a convicted violent felon wearing an orange jumpsuit, sleeping on a thin mattress in a concrete cell. I have no daughter-in-law. The woman who laughed at my pain is currently sitting in a federal facility facing massive conspiracy and fraud charges. They do not exist in my reality anymore. They are nothing more than cautionary tales, ghosts of a terrible past that I successfully defeated. I walk inside the warm cabin and step into the rustic kitchen. I open the heavy wooden cabinet above the counter and take down a bottle of 20-year-old premium bourbon. I reach for a heavy crystal glass, the only ornate item I brought with me from my old life. I pour a generous measure of the dark amber liquid. The rich smell of toasted oak and vanilla fills the air. I do not pour this drink to drown any lingering sorrows. I do not have any sorrows left to drown. I walk back out onto the wooden deck, carrying the heavy glass. The sun is just beginning to dip below the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of dark purple and fiery orange. The cold mountain breeze washes over my face. I look out at the vast, beautiful emptiness of my new world. I raise the crystal glass, holding it up toward the fading sunlight. I take a slow, deep breath of the incredibly clean air. I take a sip of the warm bourbon, feeling the pleasant burn slide down my chest. I stand there in the perfect, absolute silence, raising my glass to toast my flawlessly executed, untouchable freedom. If there is one absolute truth I have learned from this entire ordeal, it is that sharing blood does not entitle anyone to your dignity. For years, I confused parental love with endless sacrifice, believing that if I just gave enough, my son would eventually respect me. But parasites do not respect their hosts. They only drain them until there is nothing left. True peace does not come from silently absorbing abuse to keep a toxic family together. It comes from having the incredible courage to draw a hard line and fiercely protect your own worth. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. If you believe in standing up for your dignity and cutting toxic people out of your life, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.